Hello, my name is Michael O'Keefe, aka The Movie Wizard. If you enjoy this interview and want to hear more top-notch film industry conversations, please press the thumbs up, subscribe to this channel, and hit the bell to stay in the know. Hello, Chris Kobin. We're going to talk about your relationship with David F. Friedman as well as meeting Russ Meyer, but may you please introduce yourself to my audience?
Yeah, I'm a producer in Burbank. I've been producing films and TV shows for about 25 years. I started off in television movies working for Ed Asner. I did a movie that reunited Ed and Mary Tyler Moore, and then another one that I produced with Mary Lou Henner. But I've always been really interested in exploitation film. And when the film Ed Wood came out, I think it was in the early 90s, I liked the movie, but I thought, wow, they're making the movie about the wrong guy. It should be Russ Meyer. I thought it would be tough to track down Russ, and I went to the local video store, which was called 2020 then, and I rented one of his movies. I think it was Faster Pussycat. And when I looked in the back of the, I guess it was a VHS back then, when I looked in the back of the tape, his home phone number was on it. 213-799-4461, I think it was. So I wasn't really prepared to pitch him. I was just trying to get in touch with him. And I called, and this woman's voice said, RM. And I said, yeah, can I speak with Russ Meyer, please? And she said, I think he's in the desert. Can you hang on, please? And she put me on hold. And I went, oh, man. I'm about to talk to Russ Meyer. So he picked up the line from he had a Cadillac convertible back then, and he goes, RM. And so now I'm just trying to think of what to tell him. And I said, Mr. Meyer, this is Chris Kobin. I'm a producer in Hollywood. I'm really interested in your work. I love your videos, and I want to do a CD. I want to do a CD-ROM on your career. And he goes, stop right there. I hate CD-ROM. If you want to talk about CD-ROMs, I'm going to hang up on you right now. So I started backpedaling, and I said, no, actually, I really want to do something about your career, and I understand you're writing an autobiography, which he was. And I set up a meeting with him at Swiss Chalet, which is on Lancashire, which is his favorite restaurant. And over the next 4 years, I got to know him really well. His career was pretty much over, at least his great films were over. And he was writing an autobiography, which he had in a box at that point. It took him forever to approve the photos. And it was, if you know anything about the book, it's like 1,800 pages, and it's just an exhaustive account of his entire career. And we got to be very good friends. And he was a real interesting man. I was glad to know him.
So you tried to do a show, or did you do the show, Faster Pussycat, Russ Meyer?
Well, this is before the internet, and this is before the current state. This is before Netflix and all of that. This is back in the 90s. So there were only movies then. So I was friends with Steve Nemeth, who I'm still friends with, who owns Rhino Films. And I brought Russ in to meet with the two owners of Rhino Films, who were huge Russ Meyer fans. He was really an interesting guy. He was an all-American, pro-military exploitation director. So I picked him up one time in a Volvo, and he looked at the car and he goes, God damn, Swedes didn't support us in Vietnam. People don't really know that about him. But he was in Patton's Brigade. He was a cameraman. And when he came back to America after World War II, he was actually on the beach at Normandy. He shot a lot of the footage that's in the film, Pat. And when he came back to America, he just wanted to join the union, the camera union. And there were just too many guys coming back, so they wouldn't let him in. So he got a bunch of his friends together from World War II, including Jim Ryan and a few others. And they gathered their money together, primarily his money, and they shot a movie called The Immoral Mr. Tease, which they made for about $50,000. And the first year, and they used to exhibit movies themselves, and I'll get to David Friedman in a moment, who is another one of these guys. And in the first year that film was out, Mr. T's, it was about a guy who can look at women and see through their shirts. So the only nudity was from the waist up, and it made $1 million in 1 year. And he said, "Wow, I don't really need the studios. I'm going to make my own movies." And he ended up. He was literally the first auteur. He wrote, directed, cast about 22 films, and he owned all of them when he died.
Damn. Could you expand a little bit more about what kind of guy he was like?
Yeah, he was a big, loud, but private guy who lived in a house in the Hollywood Hills by Lake Hollywood. When you went in the house, it was like a museum to his movies. Every ounce of space on the walls was covered with his art. And if you know his career, he was really into pop art. He was the first editor to really cut movies the way he did, from weird angles. And he cut to music, which nobody did back then. And he had all kinds of statues. And he was good friends with a cartoon artist named Bill Ward, W-A-R-D, who's very famous for doing very busty women with, as Meyer called them, wasp-like waists. So it was really fun going. In fact, his neighbors didn't like him, so I think he painted his house either orange or pink back in the 60s to get them back. And he was a good guy. He would call me a lot to go out to dinner. And one of the dinners we went to, he wanted to go to Musso and Frank, which is still one of my favorite restaurants in Hollywood. It's featured prominently in the most recent Quentin Tarantino movie. And he said, "Let's go over to Musso and Frank. I want you to meet this friend I've got named David, who's also a producer. He's actually a Carney guy. I think you'll like him." So I went over to Musso and Frank with Russ, and David turned out to be David Friedman, who I knew from his gore, the movies he did with Herschel Gordon Lewis. He and Herschel Gordon Lewis were in the 50s. They were doing biology movies, and porn became a real thing in the late 60s, mid to late 60s, and they didn't want to do porn. They liked doing their horror, and they liked distributing it themselves, and they had a really good thing going. So Herschel Gordon Lewis came up with the idea of doing gore movies, G-O-R-E, and that meant that they were going to use a lot of blood, and in fact, they produced a series of films called the Gore Trilogy, which was 2000 Maniacs, Color Me Blood Red, and Blood Feast. And they would take them around the country and self-distribute them and make millions. They made tons of money. So I met David at that dinner, and I said, and this is really before the internet. So there were a lot of films around that it was unclear who owned them. Some were copyrighted, some weren't. And another guy at the dinner was named Mike Rainey, which is V-R-A-N-E-Y. And he started a company called Something Weird, which is now very famous. And he started buying the copyrights to movies like the Don't Do Marijuana movie, the famous one. So anyway, I got the rights from David to remake 2000 Maniacs, which is my favorite of his movies. And we, with my partner Tim Sullivan, we made 2001 Maniacs in 2005, which has become a cult hit, I'm proud to say.
Yeah, it's a fun movie. I saw it recently, and I was wondering, what did David Friedman think about this movie?
You know what? We screened it with him, and we sat in the room with him, in the dark room, and we watched him, and he was laughing at the right times. And he said, I like it. He was an old Carney guy. He was hard to please, and especially hard to please, by the way, was Herschel Gordon Lewis, the director. But he didn't own the rights anymore. And Friedman did a lot. He did a lot of exploitation films. People don't really know, but under a different name, he did Ilsa, Queen and the She-Wolves, which was a famous exploitation Nazi film. He did all kinds of films, and his first Sumner Redstone was one of his first deals when he was just a simple distributor.
And he also did some sexy movies. And I was wondering, were there similarities in how Dave and Russ depicted sex in movies?
The only difference was Russ had a very specific brand of woman that he liked, which he became famous for, which was women with enormous boobs and very thin waists and I guess I should say ample rear ends.
Okay.
And he didn't really cast them in Hollywood. He would go to strip clubs to find them. And, you know, he was married 3 times. He was married to Eve Meyer, who was his creative genius. The first company that he had with her, she produced all the movies and handled all the money. And tragically, she was killed in the Tenerife airplane crash. It's still the biggest air crash in the history of air travel. I think like 2 planes collided and 500 people were killed. So she died. And then he married Edie Williams, who's famous for wearing outrageous, or was famous for wearing outrageous outfits to the Academy Awards. He never had kids. He was very close to his mother growing up, and he would go visit her grave every year. He'd get his World War II buddies, and they'd go up to Central California and visit her grave. And he was a larger than life guy. I've been trying to make a movie about him for 20 years, and now that Netflix is real, and Hulu and a few other places like that, what I really want to do is a miniseries on his career because it's so storied and so long. Oh, another thing about Russ Meyer. When he was in Paris after doing his tour on the beaches of Normandy, he ended up at the Ritz Hotel, and at that time, Ernest Hemingway was there. And Hemingway got to know Russ a little bit, and he found out that Russ was a virgin. So he paid for Russ's first sexual activity, and of course, Russ picked the girl with the biggest boobs. and there you go. Yeah.
Legendary story.
Legendary, yeah.
So you were going to remake another David Friedman project, which is called She Freak, and it was going to be with Pamela Anderson. So I would love to hear about that project and what happened.
Sure. My partner Tim and I were becoming well known in the exploitation genre. We also made a movie with Eli Roth, who had just done Cabin Fever. It was before he became a big deal. In fact, he produced the first Maniac movie. And Tim and I wrote 2001 Maniacs. It was a joy writing it. We just got into kind of a competition over who could come up with a weirder kill. So if you watch the movie, there's all kinds of it's more of a comic update of the film than a serious one. And I got to know David Friedman pretty well, and Tim and I asked him if we could remake She Freak, because I love that movie. It's a great movie. And he said yes. So we wrote a good script, and we got a meeting with Nick Stevens and Pamela Anderson, who was then a big star. This is back in the 90s. And we got her attached to play the lead in She Freak. And then, unfortunately, she got sick. I don't know if you remember that, but she had hepatitis C. She found out she had hepatitis C. Tim and I had a bunch of movies lined up to do. We wrote a movie also for Tobe Hooper before he passed away that he was going to direct. And I wrote a movie for Mike Richardson, who owned Dark Horse Comics, who's produced Alien vs. Predator. I wrote a film for Robert Downey Jr. called Double Exposure. We had a lot set up, and as happens quite often in Hollywood, the stuff just didn't get made. We were lucky enough to make 4 movies in 2 years. We made 2001 Maniacs. We made another movie called Snoop Dogg's Hood of Horror, which was kind of Tales from the Crypt, except we changed it to Tales from the Crib. And we went in to meet with the firm who managed Snoop Dogg at that point, and we sold it. And it was a pretty good movie. It premiered at Screamfest. And we did another movie called Driftwood. So we were on a run for a while there. But like most things in Hollywood, it just didn't last. And then Tim and I wandered off to do different things.
All right. Would you agree that sexploitation, sort of what we're talking about, the Russ Meyer, David Friedman school of sexual depictions in movies, would you agree that sexploitation is too tame for hardcore porn and too rough for the mainstream currently?
Yeah, it's a weird niche. Absolutely. It's, these were drive-in movies. So I'm old enough. I'm 61. I remember going to drive-in movies, and they kind of fell outside of the mainstream. And yeah, exactly. The reason that they're not made anymore, especially now, since everything's free on the internet, is they're not as hardcore, and they're, a bit sexier than regular movies, but their niche kind of went away. And that put a lot of guys out of business, by the way. The combination of that and the technology that's available now to everybody, where you can get porn online for free. So that really kind of got rid of all of the exploitation producers. A few of them survived. Robert Corman is still making movies, and in fact, I've worked with a couple of his editors on my last couple of horror films. But yeah, that they were in an in-between niche that doesn't exist anymore.
Damn. So what was Russ Meyer's house like?
It was amazing. It was a California modern, probably built in the 50s. It was all about, he was a single man at the end of his life. He had a German Shepherd. He loved German Shepherds. And it was a real bachelor pad. And nobody was really allowed to go into it. He also had a car. He still owns the house to this day, by the way. His truck, which says RM Films, sits in his driveway as we speak. And the woman who was his assistant, named Janice, who's a wonderful woman, kind of ran his empire. And he was always looking for the next deal. We came very close to making the movie with Rhino about his life. And he also, to the end of his life, wanted to remake Faster Pussycat. And he wanted to shoot it in color, and he still had the original shooting script. And he had kept the location under rent since he made the movie back in the 50s. And we came very close to making that also. I had it financed with Brad Wyman, who made Monster. But the problem was, and this is now early 2000s, he started calling my house and saying weird things on my answering machine. This is back when we had answering machines. And I didn't realize it at that point. Nobody did, but he was developing Alzheimer's, and which eventually killed him. I think it was in 2004 he died. But he was going till the end. And he was a really admirable guy. He was very pro-American. He fought Charles Keating, who you may remember from the SNL scandals. He was the primary motivator behind that. Keating was the head of the Concerned Citizens in Iowa or Ohio, and he sued Meyer to try to stop him from distributing his films, saying they were obscene, and Meyer fought him all the way to the Supreme Court and won. So he defeated that enemy. But he was a real macho, old-style guy. He loved to eat steak. He loved to drink, liked a good whiskey. And he loved women. He really genuinely loved women. And to this day, if you say a Russ Meyer film, people they'll know what you're talking about.
So, what did Russ bring to his films besides nudity? What was his strong points?
Well, that's a good question. His strong point was his relationships with people. He, despite his image as being a purveyor of sex and all that, he ran a very tight set. So there was no screwing around with his girls. He was a very talented editor, and he was great with music. And he literally cut films in his house. I went into his editing room one time, and there were two big 35-millimeter reels sitting on the splice machine. So he was really an auteur. I have no idea what his estate's worth, but the only film he made for a studio, which was one of his best films actually, was Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, which he made for Fox, which Roger Ebert wrote. Not a lot of people know that. The reviewer, Roger Ebert, wrote that. And when Russ passed on, he gave me a script, which was going to be a sequel to it, called Up from Beyond the Valley of the Dolls or something like that. But he made Fox a lot of money. They were in big trouble in the 70s. And that film, even though they were embarrassed by it, I think was their number 2 grossing film of that year. And it had a lot of sex. And, it was his formula. So it was big, busty, beautiful women. And the one interesting thing about Meyer was, while he was known for employing, as he called them, amply endowed vixens, in his movies, the women were always in control of the men. The men were usually big, dumb, kind of horny guys, and the women were in control of the action. They decided when to have sex and when not to. And so he, in a weird way, made the first real feminist film, which John Waters loved. The exploitation director, John Waters, said that Faster Pussycat was not only the best film ever made, but it was probably the best film that would ever be made. But he made the mistake of giving Meyer's home address in the interview, so Myers never talked to him again.
Aw, bummer. Okay, well, Chris Kobin, thank you very much for your time today. Before I let you go, may you please tell me what projects you have coming out and what do you have planned for the future?
I have a movie that's just come out called Gothic Harvest, which we shot in New Orleans. It stars Lynn Shay, who I've done 5 movies with. She's now known for Insidious and The Grudge. And when I first started working with her years ago, she was mainly known as a comic actor. She was the funny landlord, the tan landlord in Something About Mary, and she was the woman with the bowling pin in Kingpin. And so I have that coming out. I have a documentary coming out about the Hart family, which was a family that was killed when their car went in the Pacific Ocean about a year ago. It was a huge story. And we just made a distribution deal with the company that released the Linda Ronstadt documentary, which I love. I'm hoping to do a documentary about Pamela DeBar, who was the original groupie. The word groupie was invented for her. I've known her pretty well for a long time. And I have another film, which I'll just tell you is intended to be The Expendables with horror icons.
Ooh.
So I wrote it with Robert Englund, who's Freddy Krueger, and I've done 2 movies with. And he's going to call Danny Trejo and Tony Todd. And
oh, my God.
Yeah, it's going to be a huge horror festival film, and we're going to hopefully be shooting that this spring.
Okay, Chris Kobin. Well, that's great. Thank you so much for your time.